Why are young men and women suddenly dying of heart attacks? Why has puberty begun earlier? And why does Gen Z look older for their age? This is what we're going to be talking about in today's episode. Hello, everybody. My name is Lakshan. I'm your host for this episode.
And I'm Goldie, and this is episode 34 of Mind the Gen Gap podcast.
So, Goldie, when I was looking for some interesting topics to address, I came across this meme phrase about Gen Z aging like milk. And suddenly something clicked because a couple of days back I was traveling. I was in a different city on a team coaching assignment. It's with a aesthetic healthcare business, and during our scoping we of course cover a bunch of stuff. There was one thing that stuck out to me. I noticed a surprising number of people in their early 20s coming in for aesthetic treatments like hair trans. I saw like 25-year-olds, 27-year-olds coming for hair transplant, some skin tightening, some Botox, some filler, and things of this nature. People in their 20s, right? Of course, their 40s and 30, all this stuff. It feels like early, and then of course I came across this topic, and suddenly this clicked. Um, so before we go into like the research and stats and data and what's happening on the ground, I'm curious to know, Goldie, what do you feel about this whole Gen Z feeling like they look older than they should for their age?
Obviously, as soon as you speak about Gen Z, the first individuals that come into my mind are my own children. And more specifically, as you speak about skincare or Botox or hair transplants, it doesn't come across as natural for me to think of such a young person, as you said, right? To be thinking about such issues. However, I will share the fact that I do notice an excess amount of importance is being given to hair care or observing the texture of your skin or paying more attention to the way you look in pictures in very sort of, I would say, innocent ways, also because it's very closely tied in with them being more exposed, right, to social media or having very easy access to phones that have cameras, which is not something we previously had. Therefore, there's this focus on what you look like through a photo. And isn't it true that when we see ourselves in the mirror, we often look for our flaws rather than our beautiful, attributes. It's just a very natural human tendency to focus on that. And if you couple that with their growth phase, which is adolescence, in this case, of course, a lot of Gen Z are older now. They've crossed adolescence as we speak. But many of them are still in their mid-teens, so 16, 15 plus. And I think it's an age when you want to look your best. So in many ways, I feel this aging thing has been contributed not so much to them literally looking older, but they feel like they need to look older. That's what's coming up for me.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring this up, Goldie, because it's like there's a skewed perspective through which they're operating, and uh, we're going to be covering that in the two sections of this episode today. So the first one, we're going to be covering what are some lifestyle rated factors when it comes to this whole aging thing, and the second one is what are some life factors related to this aging thing. So obviously we'll start off with the first section. It'll be weird to start off the second one. So when I say lifestyle factors, I mean things like your food and diet, your skincare, as you said, Goli, product overuse, your sedentary lifestyle, and sleep and like over supplementation. Because it's like you notice a lot of these things, and you at that age you want to kind of start almost rectifying it as if it's a problem then and there itself, right? So we'll start with food. I'm not going to talk about this whole GMO and some TED talk I'm not going to give. I'm just going to talk about how it is very hard to ignore that the food system has changed a lot, of course, since you were a child, but then even since we were kids. I'm not even talking about millennials, I'm talking about zillennials also. It's changed quite a bit. There are more, highly processed foods. They're more highly processed. uh, of course, your hormones and plastics and all this kind of stuff, right? And a lot of Gen Z are eating foods that look like foods but don't actively behave that way when they are inside our body, right? And because of which we see puberty starting earlier, hormonal acne well into adulthood, your IBS, PCOS, chronic inflammation, all of that stuff in the early 30s, things that should not be there when you're supposed to be at the most vital stage of your life, so to say, right? And when your body is always in this constant state of alert and things going wrong, so to say, you tend to age physically, biologically. And there is this whole fast food intake thing and ultra processed foods, as I already mentioned, which starts off at a very young age and it's going to contribute to this mess. I think I mentioned in a previous episode about how my mom was like, I don't know how you guys are going to survive until our age. We're very fortunate that, without taking any medication or whatever, we're healthy in our 50s and all. I don't know what you guys are going to do. I also don't know what we're going to do. And if that's the case for us, I don't know what it's going to be like for Gen Z and who knows Gen Alpha as well. So this is the food and diet aspect of it, right? Then we have, as I mentioned, and as you mentioned as well, the skincare aspect. So, I mean, we already spoken about how Gen Z is the most health conscious generation so far, and they're a massive proponent of self care, taking care of yourself, and all that, which is obviously great. But the problem with respect to skincare, as we spoke about, is that we tend to overdo that side of things. Social media is there, constant comparison is there, influencers are there, celebrities are there, and this whole makeup and beauty influencer boom happened sometime, I think, about half a decade back, and a lot of um, as you said, right, the people who are 15, 16, 17, that age, a lot of them who are that now, they got exposed to it when they were like 12, 13, and all that stuff. So when they, as they went along with their puberty, they also got exposed to these beauty influencers and all that stuff, and they started trying all these cosmetics then itself. Now, the issue with that is that dermatologists talk about how using all of these anti-aging products and retinol and all that stuff is going to be super counterproductive, especially when you do it at a young age, where it's going to cause like hypersensitivity to your skin, and as you mentioned, for hair and hair thinning and all this stuff. There are people who started taking your minoxidil and finasteride, the hair loss protocol, when they're doing perfectly fine. Like,
Yeah.
it's when they see like regular, normal, healthy shedding of hair, they
Yeah.
think, oh no, I'm losing hair, and they start taking that stuff when they should not, because it messes with your hormones. I know it because unfortunately my hair isn't meant to be staying on my head for too long, so I had to resort to this protocol myself. So I know for a fact that it's not something that you should be taking otherwise. Again, ironic thing is that in the quest to look younger as a younger person, you end up looking older.
Yeah.
Then there is how much physical activity we have, how much we move. We know this as well. Like, the typical Gen Z person is sat on the seat for about 8 to 10 hours a day, always on the screen for work, resting, connection, talking to people, all of this stuff, right? The issue also is that there is this constant exposure to blue light, and there's also this data which says that physical activity amongst Gen Z has dropped from like 58% in 2021 to 56% in 2022. In a matter of about a year or so, it's dropped by 2%, right? And this was like post pandemic. It's not, we can't blame the pandemic time for this. This is just after that. So all of these things are obviously going to play a factor in how tired we feel all the time and physically aging. And then of course there's a sleep aspect. We don't sleep. It's interrupted. It's shallow. Always on the screen. We spoke about blue light. Um, you don't get REM cycle sleep, no recovery, and you're just in this constant state of like being hyper alert. There is this data which says that only 35% of Gen Z sleep more than 7 hours a night, and 93% of them admit to staying past their bedtime due to social media and Netflix and
Yeah.
streaming services and all this stuff, right? And of course, it's going to kill your sleep, and you'll feel exhausted. And I mean, we know that we speak about beauty sleep for a reason, right? Like you don't sleep, you're not going to feel beautiful, and you're going to think you're aging, and it's all of that stuff. So I mentioned these four factors. We spoke about food and skincare, and something that you mentioned as well, right? And lack of activity and sleep. So as I bring all of these lifestyle factors, as I call them, what is something that you're noticing?
I mean, all of them have at some point played into my role as a mother to my children. It's not something I've escaped. Let's put it that way. Let's start with skincare. Okay, so we're all familiar with the Sephora kids. This is the famous documentary that's floating around about not specifically Gen Z, but a lot of Alpha, who I feel sad for because they're even younger. As you said, have been exposed to these products through TikTok or influencers that essentially is not an expert. Let's just put that very clear in the front of this conversation. They're not experts on what is contained inside the product. What they're selling to you or what they're influencing you on is a byproduct of what this thing will do or could potentially help you with. Now, it's not a lie. It is partially the truth. However, what is the target audience when these products are launched into the market? So let's start with what you said, retinol. Now, retinol is a very highly concentrated active ingredient, which is a form of vitamin A that actually targets fine lines and wrinkles. Now, we know that is not the market to focus on, a tween or in this case, Gen Alpha, even Gen Z for that matter. So I remember thinking these brands are being packaged and marketed and obviously being exposed on social media for young girls because the way they're presented, it's like these pink boxes or with names like Drunk Elephant. Now, this is not a brand that you would associate as a Dior or a Yves Saint Laurent or any of these other bigger names. This is a very cute, like appealing name to a younger child. Let's not even go too far. So there is this debate that I've been listening to, where dermatologists, so now we're talking to the experts who are saying, if we cannot control what they are exposed to, it's the parents' responsibility to educate their children or to at least have a look at what is on the product before buying it for them. Because let me say, they're not cheap either. So, anything from Drunk Elephant or Laneige, which is another brand that's sort of floating around in the world of these young girls, is not less than $30 for one product. That's money that you can save, right? So the bottom line here is I've been through it. I've experienced that phase with my daughter. I've had to be in Sephora for hours, her checking out stuff, showing me what she wants. And I've looked and read the back and I said, no, I'm sorry, this is not for you. I've also experienced where she's suffered from acne. Every child who suffers from acne is suffering. And let's not downplay that because it's not nice to have acne. It's not nice to have spots. So as a parent, again, it's your responsibility to take your child to the dermatologist. Don't buy off the counter, especially not from Sephora, just because your daughter said, oh, look, this helps me fix this. Okay. A huge contributing factor, believe it or not, Lakshan, that has led to this obsession with skincare, hair care was actually COVID. Because if we go back to the times of COVID, there was a lot of exposure to screens, right? We know this. Now, a lot of the videos and reels that I remember my children watching were targeted towards them on the phase that they were in, which was acne at the time. Both of them were. And every day I would hear my son say, hey, look, mom, if I do this, it'll go in 10 days. In parallel, mom, if I buy this product, it'll help me. And so there you go. It was all kind of, they were pumping it more during the pandemic because they could. And that's just skincare and hair care. Sleep, again, devastating facts coming up. I mean, just yesterday, I shared an article from The Guardian to my daughter saying, you need to sleep between 8 to 10 hours. Again, guilty, she doesn't. So everything that you're mentioning is a hard reality, and it's happening not just here in my home, but in everyone else's home to some degree, higher or lower. I think food is something where I can say, perhaps because it's how you practice at home is what's normally perceived, and then they listen, of course they listen, but what they see is more what they practice. So if as a family you are encouraging your children to eat a healthier meal, that is far better than telling them, hey, you must not eat this, you must eat this. They're not going to listen. So but of course this is all very relative to each family, I think. And as in the age bracket that they are, I come back to this huge parental responsibility that we have to really check in on what are they exposed to and what are their insecurities, because a lot of this aging comes from a predisposition of their personalities at this age, which is to look their best. Anecdotally, yesterday, I was going through some old photos of mine where I must have been pretty much the same age as my daughter, 16, 17. And she looked at these pictures and said, oh, wow, your skin was really good. Now, I was struck by this remark coming from a 17-year-old, when I clearly remember when I was 17, I don't think I ever spoke about my skin to anybody. I lived and I dealt with what I was going through, because we all go through stuff in our teen years, but you don't sit and have conversations about, oh, how can I improve my skincare? So that's how generationally we've changed our conversations. And she actually asked me what my skincare routine was, which of course I had no memory about, because it was not an important factor that I, gave so much value back then. Today, yes, I'll walk you through my skincare routine, but there is a huge, almost 30 years have passed since.
Yeah, yeah. What came up for me as you were talking about this COVID angle as well is, of course, while they were pumping out this content, another thing that came up for me for why that cohort of people ate it up was simply because, I mean, there's nothing else to do, right?
Right.
You're at home, sat at home, nothing else to do. Might as well just play around with some cosmetics and see what it's like and how they work out, right? It's an interesting like perspective. I don't consider that at all. And also what you said about like when you were her age, like skincare was not a thing you thought about, or
No,
it wasn't. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it didn't enter my line of thought to consider if I needed to use an exfoliator or eye cream. All these things have entered into my view maybe 10, 12 years ago. However, I see it prematurely being introduced at a much earlier stage in the Gen Z generation. Yeah.
I'm also reminded of um, one of my friends. She was speaking about how there was a time, I think until maybe 3 4 years back or something like that, or maybe even like 2 years back, where she was at home and she just did not feel that she looked good or attractive, or she don't like the way she looked at when she looked at herself in the mirror, and she sat at home. She just has applied like makeup on her. She's not going anywhere, no nothing, just to feel like she looks attractive, right? And on video calls and all that stuff, yeah, she was talking about how it was a struggle for her to let that makeup go, and not use it while sitting for calls, and just as she was operating at home. So I understand, and this was, of course, she also is Gen Z, but zillennial types. I'm thinking about how, if that's the case for them, it
Yeah.
must be even more so for people who are like core Gen Z, as we call it, right? Yeah, that's
And
an interesting thing.
I'm just reminded of another important, insertion that's come into our society, which sadly is now being, exposed at the side effects of it, which is vaping. You know,
Yes,
it's
yes,
so
yes.
whilst we are very acutely aware that Gen Z are drinking a lot less alcohol than their predecessors ever have, which is great. However, they are on the other end vaping more than ever before, because as we know, Juul and all these brands introduced their brand and targeted who? Teenagers, because it was at some point even seen as harmless. It's just something, it's just, I don't know, what was it? Some aroma of fruit you're inhaling, which of course is completely not true. And now we are learning that it's having detrimental effects on their lungs with prolonged usage. So there's another, wonderful example, not a nice one, of course, that is contributing to them prematurely, probably aging. And that has, as we know, impact on their physical activity. And of course, it shows on your face, doesn't it? Even a smoker, you can see a smoker when
Yes.
you know they've done it for a few years.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we move on from the factors that are essentially influenced by an individual, the things they do and they don't do,
Yeah.
and move on to things that are, let's say, beyond them for the time being, right? And that's what segment two or section two is about, which is about the life factors. Now, you can also call them stress factors, because that's what we're going to talk about, all the various things that contribute to their emotional strain and the mental health and the constant state of stress they're in, right? So, according to the American Psychological Association, 58% of Gen Z say they feel completely overwhelmed on most days, and 42% have already been diagnosed with some form of mental health condition. I think this is something we've addressed even in a previous episode. But what we haven't addressed is that in India, there are recent surveys that show that over 56% of Gen Z report high levels of anxiety, and about 25%, that's one four, have considered seeking therapy or support, though many cite affordability or stigma as barriers. These are huge numbers, right?
Yeah.
And what we're seeing is that they're not only self-aware, they're hyper-aware, right? And that if you're constantly in a state of like being aware, it's going to take a toll on you. You're like, okay, you know everything that's wrong, but you don't know how to change it or whether it's possible to change it, right? So you're in this constant state of exhaustion, which is why many Gen Z folk don't feel young, not emotionally, right? Because they feel responsible all the time, tired all the time, and behind all the time. Behind, either comparing themselves where they are to where the previous generation were at this age, or just comparing themselves and seeing whether they're behind or ahead with their peers as well, right? That's the first aspect. Secondly, we speak about digital life. I mean, we already touched upon this with respect to the screen time and all that, but it's this constant state of being emotionally overstimulated. TikTok and Instagram and Twitter, X rather, Reddit, and now there's AI, Chat GPT, and all this stuff. The only thing that Gen Z has ever known is a world that moves at like 100 miles an hour, and when you're expected to perform and be perfect constantly at that rate, it's going to kill you, right? And it's not even for like a academic or career purpose anymore. It's an existential thing. Just to exist, you need to be constantly in keep up mode, right? And then there's the next one, which you see so much in our work as coaches: the burnout, workplace burnout, career fatigue, having no purpose in my life. The Gen Z reports it in the within the first 5 years of their work life. If it was people reporting it after 10, 15 years, that's a different story. I'm sure that you would have heard people speak about burnout being something that comes up about, say, 15 years into their work life. Now it's coming up within the first 5 years, right? There's a 2023 report from LinkedIn India, which found that 71% of young Indian professionals feel burnt out, citing long hours, lack of direction, and constant performance anxiety as the reasons for it. And then there's the last bit, which is like the heaviness of modern life, let's call it. So, what's interesting is that Gen Z, while they grew up with internet access, they also didn't grow up just with that. They also grew up with crisis access, right? They constantly aware of all the crises that are happening around us: climate change, economic situations, wars, we spoke about the situation with respect to the tension between India and Pakistan, the geopolitical tension right now, right? I mean, we spoke about what are some protocols that have been issued by the government over here. And it's, of course, cancel culture, wokeism, which is something we spoke about. Constantly being in a state of can't say something wrong, can't do something wrong, I'm going to get cancelled, and so on and so forth. The after effects of the pandemic are still very much present and relevant. And there's, of course, the job market, and that being a mess as well. And all this, say, moral fatigue is obviously going to age you much, 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 much faster. We spoke about all of these things at some point or the other in previous episodes. But when I bring them all together over here, you can see how one would think that, or they, Gen Z themselves would think that they're aging rapidly, right?
I mean, I think the word that comes to my mind, and of course, you've given me an entire list of reasons, which, let's be honest, not every single Gen Z experiences all of them. God forbid, honestly, but that would be tremendously, harmful to them. But the overarching sort of big word that comes to mind is worry. Are they just constantly in this mindset of I'm worried about this or this or this? Whereas I don't at all remember experiencing extreme, amounts of worry growing up. Yes, of course, I was concerned about specific things, but they were my problems, right? We've always been a self-centered society in terms of adolescence. I mean, it's part of their DNA until they realize what empathy is, until they realize how to accept other people's viewpoints, etc. But for the most part, it's about me and my problems. However, when you speak about what else there is for them to worry about, it's almost like their own issues become so small and insignificant. And so when you talk about a crisis, it's also an identity crisis. And where do I fit into this entire huge pool of problems where I'm probably the last person who should be worried about myself? I need to address whether, I need to prepare for a war protocol tonight, or I need to understand whether, you know, uh, is my job going to be lasting, because there is so much at stake here in terms of my skills. And let's not forget the ageism piece, where organizations are being ageist against, whether it's boomers or Gen Zers, because they have little or no experience. And so they're targeting them for that. So there's a lot, right? I mean, I've just mentioned two things. Cancel culture. Yes, I'm not extremely familiar with it, but I can understand how this can become a huge problem. In fact, I very clearly remember coaching a Gen Zer who was in charge of the social media management side. So she was a community manager as one of her many roles in her organization. And she actually experienced a lot of trolling as one of her points to work on in her sessions with me. And as much as I was fascinated to hear about what that really means, what really struck me was the way it can impact you in your head when you don't distance yourself away from a situation of being trolled. And we used to think, or at least I used to think, that being trolled was something celebrities have to deal with, or public figures. But this was happening on an organizational community page where she had to face it. And I can't begin to imagine the stress that may have caused her.
Yeah, it's so interesting that, I mean, there's so many factors beyond, of course, whatever we shared right now here today that could contribute to this constant, state of being stressed. Like I'm kind of coaching someone who is in this place where his parents are divorced, and he's kind of dealing with the tug of war that's happening over there as well, right? It's like all these things are there, and then there is your issues, and you don't know which one to look at, and it's a tough place to be, man. Seriously, but I think it. But when you really think about, are Gen Z actually aging faster, or like aging like milk, as some trolls say? I think the answer to that actually is both yes and no, because Gen Z itself is a large generation, and let's not look at the more highly visible and loud representatives of this generation and generalize that okay, this entire generation is this way. It's not. Just as there are the odd anomalies in each generation, that's the way it is over here as well. So like do they look older than they should? Some do and some don't. But do they feel like they're already old? Yeah, I mean you can see why. So the next question to ask is what can we do about it? It's hard to find a simple solution because it's
Yeah.
a generational systems issue and not just a Gen Z issue, but that's a topic for another episode, is what I feel. So until then, let's start and continue having these conversations, because that is always going to be the first step to truly minding the Gen Gap. Also, you know how else you guys can mind the Gen Gap? By subscribing to our podcast. We are on season 2, all because of you, and we need your support to keep this going.
Please,
All,
please.
yeah, and if you guys have any certain topics that you would like us to address, please reach out to us on our socials. We are very much active on LinkedIn, and Goldie herself is active on Instagram as well. So please feel free to do that. With all that being said, we have come to the end of episode 34 of My The Gen Gap podcast. I've been your host Lakshan.
And I've been your co host, Goldie.
Thank you so much for listening, watching, and tuning in all the way to the very end.
Muchas gracias.
See you in the next one.
Hasta pronto.
Bye.